Hey guys, now that the season is over, we are now doing a player ranking for Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels. So we'll be ranking all 24 players based on the games that they played during the season. And this was definitely an interesting list to put together. There are definitely some wonky placements relative to how they finished, but we'll get to that soon enough. But there are 24 players to talk about, and as always, no more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 24, the player believed played the worst game on the season is not the first boot of the season, but the second boot, and here we have Jessica. Now, the main pro to give Jessica is she does survive a tribal over Frankie, but even then, that was largely in a position where she was on the bottom. People wanted to target her initially due to her not really building bonds with people, and she's kind of just saved due to people like Eden recognizing her as a number. So even then, I don't really give her that much credit for that move. And then moving forward, she proceeds to target Eden, one of the few people that's willing to work with her, that causes them to immediately turn on her. And while she is taken out in a 6-4-1 vote, that was largely a split vote to where she was going home regardless. So really, I find Jessica's game to be pretty bad with very little upside, all things considered, outside of the fact that she does survive a tribal. But even then, I don't really give her that much credit for it. I feel like she's a bad player. So because of that, I do have her here number 24. Now moving on to number 23, we are actually moving on to the third boot of the season. And here we have Peta. And obviously Peta was a fan favorite coming into the season. A lot of people had high hopes for her, but she kind of just flamed out right away, where she was very clearly on the bottom from the start, where even though she was able to build a good alliance, that alliance was in the minority, and they even go so far as to throw the third immunity challenge in order to target Kelly, which is obviously pretty misguided, and then she herself is immediately targeted, being taken out with an idol in her pocket, which is pretty bad there. So in a lot of ways, I find Peta's game to also be pretty bad, and there isn't really that much to praise about it, outside the fact that she didn't initially go to tribal, but still, she has taken out the first opportunity, and because of that, she is here number 23. Now moving on to number 22, we are finally at the first boot, and here we have Frankie, who is obviously my winner pick coming to the season. I'll take that L right there. And I feel like Frankie's game is pretty similar to Peta's, where she is able to build an initial group with the strong guys there, except that group is on the minority, and they don't really try to branch out to try to become the majority, and they end up being sniped out over the likes of an easy target in Jessica, which is obviously pretty bad. And again, there are a lot of similarities between Frankie and Peta's game. The main reason I have Frankie over Peta is I feel like Frankie has more redeeming qualities to her game, where at least she didn't have an idol in her pocket to begin with, whereas Peta could have stayed herself, and plus her group didn't throw the immunity challenge to take out this easy target. So I feel like Peta could have done more to avoid her boot in her particular round, whereas I feel like Frankie's boot is a bit more natural within the game, but still she is the first boot of the season, to where she's here number 22. Now moving on to number 21, we have another relatively early boot, and here we have Nathan, another person who I was high on coming to the season. I was really just all over the place with my reads coming to the season here. But again, Nathan's game is also mostly bad, where he was working with Frankie early on. That group is blindsided at the first tribal they go to. We then get to the second tribal, where he is the secondary target, where Eden put votes on him in case there was an idol being played, so that's pretty bad. And then we get to his actual boot round, where he's again on the minority there. So really, Nathan's game is mostly bad, where despite him being one of the more physical guys on the cast, the fact that he was never really in the majority alliance is pretty bad by itself. And I feel like there isn't really much to redeem with his game overall, to where I have him here number 21. Now moving on to number 20, we are jumping forward quite a bit in the boot order to the end of the pre-merge, but we do have Kelly. And I'm sure some people were expecting her to be this low. And obviously Kelly's a terrible player. I think she's probably one of the worst Australian Survivor players we've ever seen. And despite her getting all the way to the final round before the merge, I found her game here to be mostly lackluster. Now, the one pro you can kind of give her is the fact that she was technically within the majority for most of her run, except even then, it was largely in a spot where people just didn't see her as much of a threat, and she never really built many bonds across the season, unless you want to count Raymond, I guess. But early on, she's obviously at the bottom of her group, where she really just irritates a lot of her tribe to the point where Alex wants to throw the immunity challenge in the third round, and she's largely able to survive that due to Kirby wanting to pick her up as a number because, like I said, she's not really seen as much of a threat. And that's really her best case scenario across the season, is the fact that she's seen as such a GOAT and someone that can be dragged to the game, that there's no reason to take her out. And really, that should have set Kelly up to get even further in the game than what she ended up doing. But even in that position, she ends up messing it up for herself, where we get to the very next round where they are splitting the votes on Alex and Tobias, and she ends up flipping her vote at the last moment to take out Tobias, despite her having a much worse relationship compared to Alex. And in doing so, she comes off as an unreliable ally to the very people that are keeping her in the game. We then get to the next round where she is sent over to the other tribe, and despite her claiming that she was able to build all these great bonds with the Titans, she's unable to relay any game information to them. So really, like, what was she actually doing there? And again, she kind of just skates on by through the rest of the game until we get to her boot round where she ends up targeting Kirby because of her one to flip on Raymond. And obviously that causes Kirby to realize that there's no point in keeping Kelly in the game, and they end up flipping the vote on her to the point where even Raymond, the person she was trying to save, ends up voting her out there. So in a lot of ways, Kelly's game is pretty terrible. She's obviously one of the worst players we've ever seen, and despite her making it relatively far into the game, she probably should have made it even further in the game until she actively messed it up for herself. So for the most part, it's a pretty bad game. But again, she did at least have some longevity, and she was technically in the majority for more of the game compared to the people we already talked about, to where she's here number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we are going back now in the boot order to Tobias. And Tobias's game is obviously pretty bad, where again, he's part of that initial group with Peta, Sarah, and Alex that's immediately blindsided the first round, and he's just taken out right thereafter. Now, there is an argument for him being higher, considering that he was technically not supposed to go home on the round he was taken out in, where the plan was to split the vote on Alex and Tobias, leaving Sarah to decide on the revote. And Sarah has said afterwards that she would have kept Tobias in the game over Alex, and he's largely taken out due to Kelly flipping her vote at the last moment, despite Alex being more actively against Kelly compared to Tobias. So to that end, you can claim that he was taken out of the game accidentally and that he was kind of screwed over. But at the same time, had the vote played out naturally, he would have still been in the minority afterwards, losing Alex, and chances are he probably gets voted out anyway the next round. So really, Tobias was not set up to do well here, and because of that, he's here number 19. Now moving on to number 18, we are again following with the boot order, and here we have Viola. And Viola's game is kind of hard to assess, where early on she is part of the majority, working alongside Mark and Valeria. Now she is left out of the middle-aged mafia, but still she is part of those early votes, taking out the likes of Frankie and Jessica. We then get to the Nathan round, where she does try to flip the game by flipping onto Caroline, but ultimately is unable to do so. And then we get to the swap, where despite her coming in with the Titans majority, she does try to pull in the old rebels to try and take out Caroline, but is completely outplayed in that round, where she's unable to convince the likes of Rihanna or Sarah to work with her. And she is taken out as a way of breaking up that trio of Mark, Valeria, and Viola. So again, it is kind of a mediocre game, nothing too much to praise there. And while I do have to commend her for trying to flip the game onto Caroline, the fact that she was ineffective in doing so is not a great look. So because of that, I do have her here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and I did consider having this person below Viola, but after thinking about it, I think this person just got more unlucky in the game, but we do have Sarah. Now Sarah is a bit of a weird game as well, considering that she was pretty much at the bottom the entire time, where early on she's obviously on the outs on the original Rebels tribe, where her group gets picked off one by one, and obviously at that Tobias round, she was meant to be spared as a way of deciding who goes home between Tobias and Alex, and obviously loses Tobias, who was one of her closest allies there, so that's pretty unlucky there. But at the same time, I feel like she probably would have been kept around over the likes of Alex had they gone to another tribal. But then she gets another pretty bad swap where she is down the numbers there. And while she is a swing vote during the initial round where they go to tribal, it's largely her distrust of people like Mark that causes her to side with the Caroline group, taking out Viola there, which I do think was a misstep. And then we get to the following round where she does play pretty poorly, where Mark again tries to work with her. And while she does like pretty bad work in telling people like Kitty that they're getting votes, by that point we see the majority flip the votes onto her, taking her out in a 4-3 vote, which again is pretty unfortunate. And I do have to fault her to a degree for the way that she played during that round by not trusting Mark as much. But again, I feel like compared to Viola, I don't think Sarah does as much wrong in the game. And you could argue that Sarah more so got unlucky by the way the trides broke down compared to Viola, whereas I feel like Viola could have done more to get herself out of her bad position after the swap. So again, I do give that edge to Sarah in that regard, but beyond that, there isn't really too much to praise, so we're ever here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we are jumping now quite a bit, once again, to someone who made it pretty deep into the game, but despite that, I find their run to be mostly mediocre, and here we have Alex. And Alex obviously got all the way to 8th place, but when you really look at his game, it is pretty terrible. Where right at the bat, he is in the minority on the original Rebels tribe. He obviously throws the initial immunity challenge, hoping to target Kelly, but it's unsuccessful there. We then get to the next round where he would have gone home had Kelly not flipped her vote at the last minute, where had the plan stuck as normal, it would have gone to a tie, and Sarah does vote him out in the revote. So really he should have been the 4th boo of the season, but is kind of saved by something completely outside of his control. We then get to the swap where he tries working with Mark and Viola to try and weaken the Caroline side, but is completely unsuccessful there, where he's on the outs during the Viola and Sarah votes. He then gets swapped over to the other tribe, where he does manage to vote out Kelly, the first time all season that he does vote correctly in an 8-1 vote, so really nothing to ride home there. And he also finds an idol during this round, which was a plan by Ferris to let Alex find it to paint a bigger target on his back, despite Alex not even being that big of a threat. So again, nothing too good there. We then get to the merge where he is once again at the bottom, where at that first vote, despite there being these two sides fighting to win out on the vote, the Ferris side and the Kirby side, the fact that Alex isn't recruited by either side in this vote and he ends up putting his vote onto Valeria is kind of insane and really speaks to the fact that people don't really trust him in the game. He does end up working with Ferris's alliance the following round, and they are successful in taking out Eden, but then the very next round, they're blindsided when they lose Eileen, which is pretty bad there. We then get to the Jaden round, where while he does vote correctly, he also plays his idol on Valeria, which only negates 1 vote, and plus he was a secondary target, so there was a world where he could have ended up being taken out despite him playing his idol there, which is pretty funny. We then get to the following round where while he does kind of build a relationship with Valeria, it's in a spot where Valeria is later taken out due to the Raymond play, which is a move that he wasn't even pulled into despite him working closely with Raymond for a lot of the post-merge, which is pretty bad. And then we get to his actual boot round at the final 8, where while he does get kind of unlucky by the fact that Rihanna ends up winning immunity, and while he does try to blow up Kirby's position at that final tribal, it was in a spot where he was the consensus target at that point, despite him being one of these smaller threats to win the game at that point. So in a lot of ways, Alex's game is pretty bad, where there are many points where he's at the bottom. He has a very wonky voting record, where there were many points where he doesn't vote correctly, even in positions where you could argue that he should have. And he obviously doesn't really win the game if he gets towards the end, unless he's up against Rihanna. So really, I find Alex's game to be pretty bad, despite the fact that he got all the way to the final 8. And also mixing the fact that he should have been voted out at the Tobias tribal, the 4th round of the season. I can't really have him any higher than number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we have someone who, if I'm being honest, isn't that much better than Alex, but they do have some minor pros going for them. But we do have Rihanna, again, another person that made it very deep into the game, despite the fact that their game itself was mostly passive and kind of bad, where you can definitely argue her being higher on the list due to the fact that she ends up working with Kirby for a lot of the game, and that you could argue that she was Kirby's second in command. Except, I don't even think she was that, considering there were many points in the game where Kirby kind of saw Rihanna as expendable, and even then, I feel like Rihanna doesn't really get her way very often. Where early on, we do see her working alongside Kirby, and she does work alongside Kirby at that first PETA vote, where they try to placate the Cuddle group by throwing their votes onto Raymond, except that move immediately exposes them as being this middle group that can't be trusted. We then get to the following round, where the Ferris group does want to break up Kirby and Rihanna, with Rihanna as the target, and she would have gone home there had it not been a non-elim, where at that point they decided to send Kelly over to the other tribe. So very similar to Alex, she's in a spot where she would have been taken out very early in the game if it weren't for something completely outside of her control. We then get to the swap, where she obviously gets a bad swap being separated by Kirby. And while she is a swing vote at that initial round, I do think she kind of botches it by voting out Viola, which I don't think was that beneficial for her. And then the following round, she is completely left out of the plan there, where she ends up being the only person to vote for Mark, and even that was negated by an idol. And I really find her post-swap here to be mostly mediocre, outside the fact that she finds an idol, which is at least something, but again, we'll get to that more soon. We then get to the merge, where very similar to Alex, she is one of the only people to not be pulled by either side, despite one of those sides being headed by her closest ally, which I think, again, speaks to how Kirby doesn't really value Rihanna in the game and doesn't really see her as an equal, which I think is pretty bad there. We then get to the following round, where while her side wins the vote in taking out Eden, she's also tricked by the other side to flushing her idol due to her thinking that she was a target there, which isn't great. We then get to the Valeria round where she does know what's going on due to Raymond's advantage and is also benefited by the fact that Valeria wanted to target her and wanted to put a vote on her, but kind of gets blocked out by the fact that Valeria doesn't do so and gets taken out instead. From that point on, she obviously becomes a target due to her challenge wins, but also her connection with Kirby, despite the fact that Kirby doesn't really value her that much in the game, where again, there were points earlier in the game where Kirby was leaving her out of the plans. And we even see during her boot round that Kirby makes a deal with Ferris that she would have voted out Rihanna had he taken her to Final Four, which I think speaks to how fine Kirby was cutting Rihanna if it came down to it. And also the fact that Kirby wasn't even going to take her to the end if they got to the end together, where she would have rather taken Ferris and tried to beat the best. So I feel like Rihanna in a lot of ways was kind of set up to fail, and she is obviously taken out at the final 7 after Kirby wins immunity there, which is unlucky, but at the same time, I find her game to be mostly mediocre, where she is very rarely the one driving things. And while I could credit her for working with Kirby for a lot of it, I don't think she had much agency within that, and the fact that she wasn't even able to get Kirby to want to take her towards the end game is pretty bad as well, to where I can't really have her any higher than number 15. Now moving on to number 14, we actually have another poster, but we do have Jaden. And Jaden's another one where despite him getting all the way to 10th place, I feel like his game for the most part is pretty passive. Early on, he's obviously on the outs during the Frankie vote. Obviously, that cuddle group gets broken up right away. And even though it's been stated afterwards that they weren't actually that close, he still was in the minority there, so that's not particularly great. And while he's kind of able to rebound, he's still not in the best spot on that try, to where during the Nathan round, he is a secondary target there and obviously loses Nathan, which is not ideal for his game. And from the swap on, he's kind of just there for a lot of the game, not really driving a lot of the action. There, he's kind of just a number for the Viola and Sarah votes. We then get to the merge where he obviously loses Wina, one of his closest allies. That's not particularly great. And then we get to the biggest moment of his game during the Eden round, where he is the one to flip on the revote to take out Eden. And I said this before, but I do think this was the wrong move for Jaden, where even though he was at the bottom of the Titans power structure at that point, and Eden had other options at that point, I still think he shouldn't have flipped, considering he didn't really have any connections on the Rebels tried to begin with. I do think he should have let it go to Rocks, considering one, he was immune to begin with, so he had nothing to lose. But I also think going to Rocks could have opened up the game in a way that would have allowed Jaden to be in a better spot, where you either take out a bigger target on the Rebels side, someone like a Ferris or a Kirby, or you take out someone like a Mark or Caroline that weakens Eden's other options moving forward and making it more likely that he chooses you as his main option. So I do think in a lot of ways, Jaden kind of throws away some opportunities by flipping on the revote, and he doesn't really gain anything from it afterwards, where yes, he is part of the Eileen vote the following round, but then he's immediately taken out the following round. So in a lot of ways, I do find Jaden's game kind of frustrating in the sense that he was mostly passive for a lot of the game, not really in the power position. And while he wasn't saved by non-elims the same way that Alex or Rihanna were, I can't really have him any higher than number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have the formal merge boot of the season, and here we have Wina. And Wina's game is kind of just fine in my view, where early on he is in a bad spot being on the outs during the Frankie vote, but he is able to recover from that. And I would say he actually recovers a bit better compared to Jaden, where moving forward he does seem to be in a better spot there. He obviously finds an idol. He then gets a pretty beneficial swap where, despite his group being down the numbers, they're able to become swing votes in the Ferris and Kirby rivalry. And while they side with the Kirby group and taking out Garrick, they obviously get very unlucky at the next round due to the whole twist that requires Wina to play his idol, which is obviously bad in the sense that he needed his idol there, but considering it was brought on by a twist, I don't fault him too much for that. And he's eventually taken out the merge in a pretty close vote where it's obviously 6-5, though at the same time there were votes that could have been picked up from people like Alex and Rihanna, but weren't, because at that point they weren't really trusted in the game. But in a lot of ways, I find Wina's game to be kind of unremarkable at the end of the day. I feel like there's not too much to praise with it, outside of him using his idol to save himself at the Charles round. But beyond that, I can't really have him any higher than number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we are finally wrapping up the pre-merge boots here. By number 12, we do have Garrick. And I was pleasantly surprised by Garrick's game on the season. Where coming into it, I expected him to kind of be aloof and not really be that good of a player, but he ended up being pretty perceptive and was able to build some pretty solid bonds with the likes of Ferris, Eileen, and Raymond. and he is able to be part of the majority early on, being part of the Peta and Tobias plans, and was also able to recognize that Kirby and Rihanna had thrown hinky votes to appease the Cuddle Club. And coming to the next round, that group was about to take a shot against Kirby and Rihanna by taking out Rihanna, only for her to be a non-limb, which is pretty unlucky. And then he gets a pretty bad swap where, despite him being with a lot of his core allies, he's also with all Kirby's people, and it's really just a fight for them to get the Titans, and obviously they do lose that battle, and Garrick is largely sniped out of the game in order to avoid an idol play, which you do have to fault him for not being able to convince Ferris to play an idol on him, and we even had Eileen also try to convince Ferris to play an idol on Garrick, only for that to be unsuccessful, so you do have to fault him a little bit for that. But at the end of the day, I still think Garrick played one of the better pre-merge games across the season, and I do feel like he kind of got unlucky by the end of his run, not only in the non-limb that prevented him from taking out Rihanna, but obviously in his eventual boot round, where obviously he was just kind of the secondary target to avoid an idle play, but still he was taken out relatively early to where he's here number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the highest ranked pre-merge boot left to talk about, and here we have Charles. And obviously Charles gets massively screwed over in the game due to the twist, and that's a big factor in why he's this high on the list. Now, if we are looking at his game before that, he is playing alright early on, being part of the majority. Now, I think something to criticize is he's never shown being part of any core group where he's not part of the middle-aged mafia, he's not part of the 2V's alliance, but he still has decent relationships with a lot of people there, and he's able to remain a majority for a lot of the early game. He then gets a pretty beneficial swap that allows him and the other Titans to be the swing votes between the Ferris side and the Kirby side, and obviously they picked the Kirby side there, which is pretty good. And then we get to the actual boot round where, had the vote played out normally, they probably would just continue to pick off the Ferris side, except we get to the twist where it's a challenge that not only decides who gets to be safe, but also decides the sole votes to evict. And Charles gets extremely unlucky in this round, considering that Eileen and Ferris end up winning the challenge, ensuring that that other side would get the numbers. But then Kirby also wins the challenge, who was the biggest target from the side that he's working with, pretty much ensuring that one of the Titans will be taken out. And even beyond that, you have Wina, who is an idol by that point. So that really just left Charles and Valeria to be picked off there. And yes, while you do have to fault him slightly for the Ferris group picking Valeria over him, it was still a series of very unlucky circumstances that probably shouldn't have mattered in most situations, except for the fact that they wanted to recreate the twist that they had in episode 7 of last season. So I do think Charles gets massively screwed over in the game, and while I wouldn't say his early game is the strongest in the world, it was still good enough to get him through the early game, and I feel like had he survived this round, he probably would have been in a good spot moving forward, but it's largely the fact that he gets taken out in such a weird way that leads him this high at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and from this point on, every single person left made the merge, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 10, we're not sticking with the boot order, we are sticking with a bit of a later boot, and here we have Eileen. And despite me being kind of low on Eileen for a lot of the season, I still think she played a mostly good game, where she does try to play the middle early on, trying to placate both of the Ferris and Kirby sides, and she is the main orchestrator of the split vote plan at the Tobias round, where she wanted to split the votes onto Alex and Tobias, ensuring that Sarah would be the one to break the tie. And while it doesn't go entirely to plan, where Kelly ends up flipping her vote at the last minute, she still was the orchestrator at that vote, which is pretty good. But then we get to the swap, which is where things get a bit more rocky, where at that point she's down the numbers, and she does lose character, which isn't great, and she's also unable to convince Ferris to use his idol to save Garrick, knowing that the votes were coming Garrick's way, which is pretty bad. We then get to the following round where she is very much saved by the twist that allows them to compete in the challenge to get a vote in safety, where despite her efforts to distance herself from the Ferris group during that round, we still saw plenty of people, including Ferris, not really trusting her that much, and had that round been a normal round, there's a very strong likelihood that she does get voted out there. So again, that round itself is pretty wonky. We then get to the merge where she does work alongside Ferris once again, and they are able to get their way at the Wina round after Ferris's deal with Caroline and Kitty, and they're even able to win the following round by taking out Eden, mainly due to Jaden flipping, which is pretty ridiculous, only for her to be sniped out the following round by Kirby as a way of getting closer to Ferris. So in a lot of ways, Eileen's game is definitely a decent one, where compared to people like Wina and Jaden, she was a lot more active in how the game played out. She was definitely trying to play the middle more, and she was able to orchestrate some plans along the way, but at the same time, she was also saved by various things, like obviously the twist at the Charles round. And I do think outside of that, Ferris was a bit more active by the end of it in terms of how they controlled the post merge. But still, I feel like Eileen played a good enough game to where she's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Scott. And obviously, Scott's a tough game to assess considering he quit by the end of it, right around the merge, and he was pretty under-edited on the show, but I still think Scott played a mostly solid game, and I do think he played a better version of Eileen's game, if I'm being perfectly honest, where he does try to play the middle with the Ferris and Kirby sides early on, and I think he is pretty effective in building good bonds with both of them to where they want to work with him moving forward, and they think that they have Scott on their side. Now, yes, the show does make it seem like he worked more with the Kirby side, and I would say he was definitely voting with them for more of the game, but he was still able to build good enough bonds with the Ferris side to where he's safer in the game, to where we get to that Charles round where he is one of only a few options that could go home there, and the fact that they choose him over Charles is really impressive in my eyes. So I do think there is plenty of merit to Scott's game considering that he was trying to play the middle, and coming to the merge, he also seemed to be in a pretty good spot coming into it, and I feel like had he been able to stay in the game, he probably would have been in it for a decent amount of time. Though by that point, his mental health had deteriorated and he just stopped caring about the game, which is obviously very understandable. But I feel like looking at the game that he played, based off what we saw, it was a pretty impressive game for the most part. And I do think it was a relatively clean game as well, to where he wasn't really targeted that much during a lot of it. So I feel like those things were enough to have him this high, despite the fact that he only got 14th place. So for those reasons, I do have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and from this point on, everyone left, made it to at least the jury phase. But at number 8, we actually have someone who I was very high on for a lot of the season until they were taken out. But we do have Valeria. And Valeria played a pretty interesting game. Now, obviously, I had her number 1 for a decent amount of the season considering her edit. But if we actually look at her game, it's not that great, all things considered. Now, early on, she is part of the majority, taking out Frankie and Jessica, obviously builds that close alliance with Mark and Viola. Now, supposedly, the Middle-Aged Mafia was planning to target that group not too long afterwards, but at the same time, they were planning to target Viola over Valeria, so obviously that's not great, but they're able to get through those early rounds all right. We then get to the swap where she's obviously put into a pretty powerful position where she sides with the Kirby group and taking out Garrick, and obviously gets pretty unfortunate by the twist falling round that causes Charles to be taken out. Though at the same time, we do have to give her a bit of credit for the Ferris side choosing her over Charles when she was one of only a few options that could have gone home there, so that's pretty good. But then we get to the merge, which is where things get a bit more wonky, where at that point she does find out that Caroline Kitty had taken out Viola, and she pretty much pledges revenge against them, but is unable to actually get Caroline out in a 6-5 vote there. And this is also the tribal where she makes her comments against Caroline, where she calls Caroline an undeserving player, which obviously gets her very upset for that following round. And while Valeria does try to smooth things over, I do think that's a pretty bad social play there. We then get to the following round where she is the initial target by the Ferris group, where he does want to target her by splitting the vote on Rihanna. And while they later back off that plan to target Eden, we then get to tribal where her side loses on that vote, loses Eden, which isn't great either. And she's obviously there for the next couple rounds taking out Eileen and Jaden, with Alex even playing his idol on Valeria during the Jaden round. We then get to the final 9 where she is sniped out of the game in order to weaken Mark. And it's obviously a pretty wonky vote where Raymond has his advantage that allows him to cast a soul vote to evict. And obviously that's kind of unlucky, but at the same time, considering the amount of people that were aware of the plan, people like Ferris and Kirby, I feel like had that not happened, they could have just found another way to take out Valeria anyway, whether it's by putting more votes onto her, maybe playing one of their idols in the process. So I'm not too sure how much she got screwed over at the end of the day. Now, you also have to factor in that she could have saved herself by throwing her vote into someone else. And while I understand why she didn't do so, as she didn't recognize the extent of the advantage and she didn't want to upset anyone by throwing a vote on them when Raymond seemed so clearly about to quit, it's still a pretty tough situation nonetheless. So on the whole, I do think Valeria played a somewhat interesting game. Now, at the end of the day, I can't really attribute too many moves to her, where even the points where she was in control after the swap, I feel like that was largely due to how the swap broke down to begin with. And even beyond that, I feel like she was largely working with Mark for a lot of the post-merge. So I'm not too sure how much she was really driving a lot of the action there, but I still find her game somewhat impressive to where I have her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who I didn't really know what to do with, but at number 7, I do have Kitty. And obviously Kitty has a lot of longevity on the season, getting all the way to the final 6. And I don't think she's that bad of a player either, where just by her being on the older side of things, she is able to be in the majority for most of her run. And I do think that aspect is pretty impressive. Now, early on, she is part of the majority, being a part of the middle aged mafia and having a very close bond with Caroline. And that is a majority early on. After the swap, she continues to be in a pretty good spot, being able to take out Viola and Sarah along the way. So, again, it's a pretty good pre merge for her. Now, I do think that the other people are in the driver's seat for more of the game compared to her. I feel like she's more so in a pretty good position, but still, she is part of that group that's able to ride their way to the merge. But then we get to the merge, which is a very wonky situation where she was the target coming to the merge, and had Scott not quit the game, she more than likely gets voted out there. And that is a pretty big knock to her game. I kind of compare it a lot to Eileen and Rihanna, people that were saved by circumstances completely outside of their control. And while I had to give her a little bit of credit for Scott wanting to keep her around during the round where he leaves the game, I still think she probably gets voted out had he not quit the game. So again, pretty bad there. I do think she recovers pretty well the round afterwards, where her and Caroline made that deal with Ferris that allows them to build a new alliance that takes out Wina. That's pretty good there. But then we get to the following round where her and Caroline immediately turn on that alliance, going behind Ferris's back to try to take out Raymond. And I do think this was a bit too early, as well, I understand they want to ensure that Ferris is closer to them than anyone else, which is really a lot of people's MO during the season. I do think this was a bit too early. I think they probably should have rode out that alliance a little bit. And through their scrambling, it does cause the Ferris group to question whether the plan is legitimate. And it causes them to shift their target onto Eden, which is pretty bad there. And obviously they lose out on that vote, losing Eden, one of their closer allies, which I do think is pretty bad there. And while she recovers all right at the Eileen round, taking her up, we then get to the Jaden round where she ends up flipping against a lot of her allies to vote with Ferris. A move that ends up confusing a lot of the old Titans, and a move that ends up causing people like Mark and Valeria to not really trust her that much coming to the next round. And from the final 7 on, she becomes part of the coalition to take out Kirby, but is unable to do so due to Kirby winning the next few immunities. And then we get to the final 6, where she is eventually taken out after Kirby wins immunity, which is pretty unlucky there. So in a lot of ways, I think Kitty played a fine game for the most part, where she was in the majority for most of the game. Now, I do think there's some wonkiness in the post-merge. The way that she acts during the Eden round and the Jaden round is not ideal. You also have her almost being voted out the merge if Scott didn't quit the game. So I think there's definitely some bumpiness along the way. Then also, I don't think she was too much in the driver's seat for much of the game, even within the middle-aged mafia. So I think that kind of leaves me from putting her higher in the list. But I do think she had a lot of longevity, and plus she obviously is in the majority for a lot of the game. That leaves her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have the earliest boot left on the board to talk about, and here we have Eden. Now I know this may seem a little high for Eden, especially considering he got 12th place, 1 round short of the jury. But I do think Eden played a genuinely impressive game up until his boot, where I feel like he was probably the most dominant player on the Titans side, which I do find pretty impressive. Where early on, he is very much involved in creating the core power structure, being able to build a close bond with Mark and form the Invisible Hand, but also have the middle-aged mafia, which did seem to be the majority alliance there, and I feel like he was the best positioned within that alliance to where he would have a lot of agency within the game. And we see him acting right off the bat where he is the main orchestrator of the Frankie boot, which I find pretty impressive. The round after that, while he does act a bit paranoid, we do see him splitting the vote onto Nathan, really ensuring control there. And really, he's in a lot of control during a lot of the pre-swap section of the game. And after the swap, he continues to be in a good position where his group takes out Viola, which had been a plan that they've been wanting to do a couple rounds beforehand, but now they had the chance to do so as a way of weakening Mark. And they're able to hold control of the following round by taking out Sarah in a spot where he wasn't even the main target by the other side, where they were gunning for Caroline more so than anyone else. So again, I feel like his pre-merge was incredibly strong, where he had a lot of agency there. And then after the merge, he's still in a good spot where, even though he gets a bit lucky by Kitty staying in the game after Scott quits, he's able to later be part of the majority during the round where Wina gets taken out, being one of the few Titans to do so, which I find pretty impressive there. But then we get to the following round where he recognizes that he can't stick with the Ferris group, and he decides to pull in all the Titans to try to weaken Ferris further by taking out Raymond. And it is impressive that he's able to pull in all of the Titans there. Except obviously it's only half the tribe, he would have needed one more, and it's not clear where he could have gotten that extra number from. And he did initially try to pin the target onto Valeria instead, but after Ferris recognized that he was the biggest threat, that causes him to make the target there. But even then, it does turn into a tie vote. And it seemed very likely that it could have gone to Rocks until Jaden flipped at the last moment. And again, I don't really fault Eden too much for getting Jaden to flip there, considering I don't think Jaden really knew what he was doing at that point. So I don't really fault Eden there, considering a lot of it feels like Jaden just didn't really know what he was doing. And even then, Eden had tried to build a bond with Jaden earlier in that round, trying to make him one of his numbers there, trying to make this Titans power structure work more for him. And I think that's another thing too, considering that had Jaden not flipped and had Eden stayed in the game, I think Eden would have still been in a strong position moving forward. Where at that point, he still would have had pretty big targets on the other side. People like Kirby and Ferris that he could have used his alliance to go after. I think within the Titans power structure, he was very well positioned. And I feel like he probably would have been able to maintain that group moving forward. So in a lot of ways, I think Eden played a pretty strong game for the most part. And yes, while he can fault certain things like the way that they handled the final round and even with the target of Wina at the previous tribal, I still think Eden played an all-around good game to where he's here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and obviously we are now down to the final 5, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 5, and I kind of debated this one to a degree, but we do have Raymond. And I think Raymond played an interesting game for the most part. Now, right off the bat, I think it's interesting how he was the vote magnet for the season, where he ended up getting 25 votes against him during the course of the season, which is pretty funny, which I do think is a knock to a degree considering the amount he was being seen as a potential target, but I also think there is a bit of leeway he can give, at least within certain rounds. Where early on he does align with Ferris and is able to build a very tight bond with him to the point where Ferris does see Raymond as his number 1, which is pretty good. At that first tribal, he is the secondary target where had Peta played her idol, it would have been a 3-3 tie between him and Kelly, though at the same time, Kelly would have been the boot over him, so I don't really fault him too much for that. And really, he is able to just kind of lay low during a lot of the pre-swap. After the swap, he is down in numbers, but he's still able to scrape through those couple of rounds. He's obviously benefited by the twist that allows his side to get the numbers there. And he's able to build such a good bond with Kelly to where after that round where Kirby wants to target Raymond next, Kelly goes so far out of her way to want to protect Raymond that it causes her to blow up her game and for the majority to take her out there. Though at the same time, I would also knock this against Raymond, the fact that he did vote out Kelly to begin with, especially when it seemed like his side could have used this whole situation to pick up Kelly as a number, but still he survives his round unscathed. Then we get to the merge where his side does pick up some leverage again, where due to Ferris's deal with Caroline and Kitty, they are able to get the majority at that round, taking out Wina, though I don't really give Raymond too much credit for getting the numbers there. But then we get to the following round where he is the direct target by the Titans after Eden pulls in all the Titans there, and it does become a tie vote, which is pretty bad there. And while Jaden does flip to keep Raymond over Eden, I give almost no credit to Raymond for that. I think that was largely Jaden acting on his own, but still he does scrape through that. After that, he's blindsided at the Eileen vote, which is pretty bad, and while they are able to recover at the Jaden round, getting the numbers there, we then get to the final 9, which is probably his biggest move of the game, where he has this advantage that's about to expire, and he decides to pull all the votes on himself so that he can use this advantage to take out Valeria. And this is obviously a very high-risk move that has some pros and cons, where on one hand, yes, he would be getting a lot of credit for this move if it were successful in this way, where he could claim this on his resume if he were to get towards the end, but it also carries a ton of risks where obviously if one person doesn't go along with the plan, then he goes home instead. And we did see Valeria very much suspect the idea that there could have been some foul play there, so that could have been risky. It also could have been risky from a jury management standpoint, where considering that we had already seen Scott quit the game for mental health reasons, the fact that he is weaponizing a quit to try to get his way here could have come off as distasteful, and obviously you can question the morality of that. And even beyond that, there were obviously other ways that they could have gotten Valeria out, where considering that people like Ferris and Kirby were in on the plan, they could have used an idol, and they could have definitely found other ways of getting Valeria out of the game that didn't have to involve Raymond being put in direct danger. So obviously you can definitely weigh the pros and cons of this, but it is effective at the end of the day. He does successfully pull off this move and getting out Valeria, which is pretty good. And from this point on in the game, him and Ferris do have a lot of agency, where they are able to get their way during a lot of the rounds, taking out Alex at the final 8, Rihanna at the final 7 after Kirby wins immunity, and Kitty at the final 6. We then get to the final 5 where he is able to take out Kirby, which is pretty good. But then we get to the final 4, which is obviously a very interesting round here, Well, on one hand, Ferris is the biggest jury threat left on the board, and considering that Mark and Caroline know this, you would think that they would take out Ferris after Ferris fails to win immunity there, which in turn would have allowed Raymond to get one round further in the game, except Raymond ends up falling victim to one, the perception that he was very loyal to Ferris and wasn't going to vote against him in that round, but also the idea that he was worse at fire compared to Ferris, which causes Mark and Caroline to run the risk of letting Ferris get deeper into the game by instead targeting Raymond, feeling like Caroline would have an easier time beating him in fire, but also the fact that it increases Mark's likelihood of getting to the final two if Raymond were to lose in fire. And honestly, Raymond does lose in pretty embarrassing fashion where he can't even get the fire starting. He's just whacking the flint, which I did find pretty funny there. Now, I think his actual decision to stick by Ferris in this round is certainly debatable in my eyes, where on one hand, I get it from the sense that he thinks he's guaranteed final two if he goes to three against Ferris. But at the same time, considering that Caroline's the only other option there, I do think he probably should have gone to three against Mark and Caroline, as I think it increases his chances of winning the game, as I think he probably wins the game if he's at the end against Caroline, which I did talk about in my jury scenarios video, as I feel like even if he had survived the final four and fire, he'd be going up against Mark and Ferris, which is still obviously a much tougher situation for him to win against, even if he were to win final immunity there. And even beyond that, he does talk in his exit interview about how he very much valued his friendship with Ferris, and that was also part of the reason why he stuck by him. So again, I do find his endgame as a whole to be kind of wonky, but on the whole, I do find Raymond's game to be not that bad, all things considered. He was definitely in the majority for a decent amount of the game, despite the fact that he was so frequently targeted. And I think he did have a winning scenario at the end against Caroline, which I do find somewhat impressive there. But at the end of the day, I feel like other people were more dominant in the game, and obviously there's definitely some wonkiness with certain rounds of his game that leaves him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and this is another person who I very much debated here, but on the other hand, this person was one challenge win away from winning the game, but we do have Mark. And I know that I was high on Mark for a lot of the season. I felt like his edit was pretty strong for the most part, and I feel like by the end, he was probably the person I was expecting to win, only to be shocked that he came up one round short. So again, I was high on him here, but despite that, I don't think his game is actually that good, where even though he does come one round away from winning the game, I feel like a lot of his game is kind of rocky. Now, early on, he is in a pretty good spot, being part of the majority there. He has a close bond with Eden, along with the two Vs. But at the same time, it does seem like the Middle-Aged Mafia had more influence on that tribe, and that they were planning to take out Viola not too long afterwards as a way of weakening Mark. And that does come to fruition after the swap, where he obviously does end up losing Viola there, which is pretty bad. We then get to the next round, where he tries to orchestrate a flip on Caroline by pulling in the old rebels, and is largely unsuccessful because Rihanna doesn't trust him, and he even wastes his idol on himself, which is pretty bad there. And his position is made even worse after Alex got swapped over to the other tribe, and after Rihanna finds the idol on their camp, to where he probably would have been the next boot had they ever gone back to tribal, but that simply never happened. We then get to the merge, where he tries once again to flip the vote onto Caroline and is unsuccessful there, where Ferris outplays him by pulling in Caroline and Kitty. And then he's on the outs again the following round, where Eden gets taken out, which admittedly is not that massive of a knock to his game considering that Eden had other options at that point, but still he's on the outs there. He's in a lot of danger during the Eileen round, where Ferris is directly coming for him, and he's largely saved by Kirby wanting to get closer to Ferris by taking out Eileen, so not too sure how much credit to give him there. He later loses Valeria at the final 9, his closest ally, which is pretty bad. We then get to the final 8, where, while he does make a deal to work with Ferris moving forward in taking out Kirby and Rihanna, he then proceeds to vote out Alex, which I do think is a questionable move considering Alex seemed pretty open to working with Mark at that point, so I do think that's a questionable decision. And then from that point on, he's largely working with the likes of Caroline and Ferris as a way of weakening the Kirby-Rihanna core by taking out Rihanna at final 7, Kitty at final 6, and Kirby at final 5. So again, that is pretty solid there. But then we get to the final 4, where he does win immunity there, and he does make a bit of an interesting decision by deciding to send Raymond into fire instead of Ferris. And I know some people will criticize this decision, as obviously Ferris is a much bigger jury threat compared to Raymond, and obviously later comes back to bite him the following round where Ferris does win final immunity. However, I actually don't fault Mark too much for this decision, considering that he doesn't have much of a relationship with Raymond, and Raymond doesn't really have much of an incentive to take him to Final 2, whereas Ferris is someone who is a much bigger threat and someone that can unite Caroline and Mark to try to take out at the Final 3. So I do think it's the correct decision of Mark to take out Raymond in this round as it weakens Ferris, makes it so that he now has a 2 and 3 chance of getting to the final two in a winning position, versus if he had taken Ferris out there, too, he probably would have had to win final immunity to avoid Raymond taking Caroline and probably Caroline being tempted to take Raymond there. But obviously, he does get pretty unlucky in the sense that Ferris does win final immunity and takes him out there. To where had Ferris not won final immunity, he does get to the end against Caroline and he should win that jury vote without too much difficulty. But obviously, he gets pretty unlucky by the end of it. So for the most part, I am kind of conflicted on Mark's game where I feel like there were many points during the game where he doesn't have much control. Where I feel like from the swap up until the final seven, I would say his game is mostly mediocre. And I think there were definitely points in there where he was in a decent amount of danger. But again, his early game was good enough. I think his end game was good enough. And he does win if he gets to the end against Caroline, which is obviously pretty good. But I feel like that middle stretch of his game is mediocre enough to where I can't really have him any higher than number 4. Now moving on to number 3. And these next two were also a very tough debate. I wasn't really sure what to do with them. But at number 3, I do have someone who was definitely a dominant force on the season, but someone who also made plenty of mistakes along the way. And here we have Kirby. And I do think Kirby is an all around pretty solid player, and I think she definitely has potential if she were to come back, even though I feel like throughout the game, she definitely made some pretty questionable decisions. Now, early on, she's obviously part of the majority where she's able to build plenty of good bonds there. But then we get to the first tribal where she does try to play a bit too cute by throwing votes onto Kelly as a way of placating both the Ferris side and the Peta side, only to immediately be caught and for people like Ferris to be somewhat sus of her, but she's able to get through that round all right. And she's able to remain in the majority for the rest of the pre-swap. We then get to the swap where at that point she does get a bad swap where she is with all of Ferris's people and they are directly gunning for her. However, she is able to pull in the other Titan. She's able to win that battle there, ensuring that they have the numbers to take out Garrick at the following vote, which is pretty solid. And they are planning to take out Eileen the following round, except for the twist that kind of screws things up. But even then, she's able to win the challenge, ensuring that she's safe. We then get to the Kelly round, which is kind of sloppy on Kirby's end, where she does initially plan to target Raymond, which in itself is kind of questionable considering that Kelly did have this close bond with Raymond. But due to her pushing so hard for the Raymond boot, it does cause Kelly to turn on Kirby, wanting to target Kirby instead. And at that point, Kirby does decide to target Kelly, which in itself is a pretty questionable move and really could have backfired on Kirby, as it could have caused the Ferris side to see Kelly as a number to pick up and really flip the game on Kirby. But for some reason, that side doesn't, which is pretty insane. And while you can credit some of this to Kirby's strong social game and her ability to build bonds with people like Ferris, I do think strategically this was a pretty questionable round for Kirby. But she's able to scrape on by to the merge, and obviously at the merge she does lose out on the battle against Ferris, where Ferris does outplay her in picking up Caroline and Kitty to take out Wina. That's not particularly good for Kirby's game. We then get to the next round where she was able to take out Eden, who was such a pivotal piece for the Titans' power structure moving forward. And then the following round she's able to outplay Ferris by being able to flip over to the old Titans to take out Eileen as a way of weakening Ferris further, which I do think is pretty good. And then she's able to ride the next couple rounds, taking out Jaden and Valeria. And she's able to do this despite Ferris not really coming for her at all, which I do think is somewhat impressive. I think it speaks to their strong relationship on the whole. Though at the same time, some of it is also due to Ferris seeing her as a shield, which I do think is a bit of a problem for her in the end game, where at that point she is such a major threat from the final 8 on. And really from the final 7, she pretty much has to win out if she has to get towards the end, which I do think is a pretty big knock to her game. At the final 7, she does lose Rihanna after she wins immunity to weaken her. That's not particularly good. Final 6, she wins immunity again in a spot where she probably goes home had she not done so. And then we get to the final 5 where she finally fails to win immunity. And we do see Ferris turning on her, despite not really being in Ferris's best interest at that point, considering that she was a shield for Ferris. But at that point, she was just a massive target that there really wasn't much she could do at that point. So on the whole, I do think Kirby played a pretty strong game for the most part. I feel like she was definitely one of the more dominant players across the season, where she had a pretty strong grasp on her tribe from early on. And while there were some mistakes along the way, she was able to maintain that control. I think she's also a very strong social player where despite her various missteps strategically, she's able to recover and is able to build strong bonds with a lot of the cast to where people don't want to come for her. And I also think she was the biggest jury throw in the season to where she probably wins against everyone left in the game by the time she goes home. Now, granted, she did want to go to the end against Ferris, which I do think is a bit of a misstep, especially with her logic of her wanting to beat the best. I do think that reasoning is pretty poor. But as I explained in my jury scenarios video, I do think she beats Ferris at the end as well. So even that's like not that bad for her. So I do think in a lot of ways Kirby played a pretty strong game, and I think if she were to come back with more strategic knowledge, I think she could be a very deadly player in the game, but she still gets taken out at the final 5 in a position where she had already won the last couple immunities, to where I can't really have her any higher than number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and obviously we are now at the final 2. It's just a matter of ordering them, and I think the order is pretty obvious to me, but at number 2 we do have Caroline, the runner-up of the season. And again, I did debate between Caroline and Kirby, to where I feel like Kirby had more control over the entire game, but at the same time, Kirby had to win out from the final 7, whereas Caroline probably had a cleaner path to the end, at least by the end of it, even though there were definitely points earlier on where she was in danger. Where early on, she's in a pretty solid spot being part of the middle-aged mafia, and it did seem like that was the true majority of that group. We obviously see Caroline wanting to target the 2Vs early on as a way of weakening Mark, and it does seem like that would have gone through at some point had they gone back to tribal. And obviously we see it play out after the swap where they are able to take out Viola there, which is pretty good. And while Mark does retaliate by trying to target Caroline at that point, and it is a pretty close vote between her and Sarah, she is able to hold her numbers while people like Rihanna don't trust Mark as much. So to that end, I do give Caroline a bit of credit for holding the numbers there. We then get to the merge where she does get pretty lucky that Scott quits the game, to where had that not happened, she would have lost Kitty, who was her closest ally by that point, and obviously would have been very bad for her game. And while she's able to avoid that, we can then get to the following tribal where she is once again being targeted by Mark, where Mark is trying to get the old rebels together to try and target her. And it is a 6-5 vote either way, which is pretty bad. Except Caroline is able to save herself, where she is able to approach Ferris in that side with a deal that allows him to get the numbers. So I do have to give her a bit of credit for saving herself. But then the following round, we see her flipping once again against Ferris, which I do think is pretty questionable. And this causes Ferris to target Eden, who is one of her closer allies as well. And she does lose out on the tiebreaker, which is pretty bad for her game. And in general, I find her early merge to be pretty turbulent for the most part, considering the amount of danger she was in. But then we get to the Eileen round, where I do think she starts to play a bit better, where at that point, she does take out Eileen, which obviously weakens Ferris to where it makes it less likely that Ferris can retaliate against her moving forward. She's able to get through the next couple of rounds all right, taking out Jaden and Valeria. And then she's able to just kind of be in the majority for the rest of the game, where she is able to take out these numbers one by one. She's able to repair her relationship with Mark enough to where they decide to work together. And they do recognize that Kirby is the biggest threat in the game, to where they try to take her out at the next couple of rounds. But then we get to the final 6, which is a pretty bad round for her, where she ends up wasting her idol on Mark, thinking that he was a target, and then proceeding to lose Kitty, who was one of her closest allies there, which is pretty bad. And in general, this whole round probably sank her chances of winning the game, as it made her come off as pretty aloof. And I think win equity is a massive issue with her game, considering from the final 6 on, I don't think she really beats anyone left in the game. I feel like she would have needed to get to the end against like a Rihanna or an Alex if she actually wanted to win the game by the end of it. But instead, she ends up getting towards the end of the game in a pretty losing spot. Obviously, at the final 4, she has to go into fire after Mark wins immunity, but is able to demolish Raymond in fire. And by final 3, she's pretty much guaranteed to get to the final 2, as both Mark and Ferris were taking her. And I think she loses to both of them, where she wanted to get to the end against Mark. I do think Mark beats her, and she obviously loses to Ferris in a unanimous vote, to where even Kitty doesn't vote for her. And I do think she has a pretty bad final tribal performance as well, which doesn't help things either. So I am kind of conflicted on Caroline's game, where I do think she had a decent amount of control early on. I do feel like there are points in the post-merge where she also had inklings of control, but I do feel like her post-merge is pretty sloppy for the most part, where there were points where she was being directly targeted, there were points where she lost her closest allies, there are points where she came off as a pretty emotional player that definitely harmed her jury perception, and really by the end, she was in a pretty losing scenario to where I don't feel like she wins the game by the end of it. But at the same time, I think she does play strong enough in the pre-merge, and she does outlast Kirby by a couple of rounds. That does leave her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe played the best game on Australian Survivor, Titans vs. Rebels, is the winner of the season. And here we have Ferris. And I'm actually surprised Ferris ended up winning the season. I feel like he was someone who was obviously a big character on the show, got a massive edit, and I very much doubted that Australian Survivor, based off recent editing trends, would allow such a person to actually win by the end. but it ended up happening, which is pretty crazy there. And I do think Ferris played a stronger game than Caroline. I would have voted for Ferris over Caroline in this final too. And I think he definitely plays a strong game, though at the same time, there are definitely some holes within it. Now, early on, he is part of the majority, being able to build a pretty solid alliance with people like Eileen, Raymond, and Garrick. I feel like that was a pretty tight core there. He's able to remain in control during those early votes, taking out Peta and Tobias without too much difficulty. Now, granted, he was the minority target at that Tobias tribal to where he uses his idol there, which isn't ideal, but still gets through that all right. But at the same time, he also sees Kirby as his biggest rival and tries at multiple opportunities to take her out, only to be unsuccessful, where we get to the swap where obviously it's his side, Kirby's side, and the Titans in the middle. He does lose the battle in getting the Titans to side with him, loses Garrick there, which is pretty bad. He then is benefited greatly by the twist at the next round, to where had that not happened, he probably is forced to use his idol there, but through that he's able to get the numbers, take out Charles, which is pretty good. But at the same time, he's probably on the bottom coming to the next round had they ever gone back to tribal. Gets benefited to a degree by Kelly turning on Kirby after Kirby had tried to target Raymond, but I also think it's a knock that Ferris doesn't even consider picking up Kelly as a number to try to weaken the Kirby side even further, but whatever. We then get to the merge where he is able to make a deal with Caroline and Kitty to pick them up as numbers to take out Wina, which I think is pretty beneficial to his game considering that Wina seemed to be closer to Kirby than to him by that point. But then we get to the next round where Caroline and Kitty are quick to flip back to the Titans, which is pretty bad, but Ferris is able to suss that out and he's able to pull all the votes onto Eden, tie up the vote there, and he gets pretty lucky that Jaden ends up flipping to send out Eden instead. But Eden going out is pretty beneficial to Ferris's game, as obviously Eden was a pretty big number for the Titans side, and it allows him to potentially get back with Caroline and Kitty. But then he's blindsided the next round where Eileen goes out. That's pretty bad. In the following round, he's in the minority during the Jaden round, which isn't great. But then from the following 9 on, I do think he plays mostly well, where at that point he is part of the Raymond plan to pull the votes on the Raymond, take out Valeria there. That's pretty good. And he even wins Best Supporting Actor at the Oscars, which is pretty funny. At the final 8, he's able to take out Alex there. Final 7 takes out Rihanna. But at the same time, he also has Kirby, who, despite them having been rivals before, he had a very strong relationship with for a lot of the game. And it was so much so that Kirby actually wanted to take him to Final 2, which is really insane when you think about it. As obviously Kirby wanted to beat the best, and he saw him as being the best there. And that really enables Ferris to use Kirby as a meat shield moving forward. Now, obviously, he would need to cut Kirby at some point, as I do think Kirby beats Ferris, but the fact that he was in that position to begin with is pretty good, and he's able to benefit from Kirby winning the next couple of immunities, allowing him to take out Rihanna at the final 7 and Kitty at the final 6. But then we get to the final 5, where Kirby does fail to win immunity, and he's in a spot to where he could have saved Kirby by playing his idol on her, only to not do so. And I do question whether this was the right time to cut Kirby, as on one hand, yes, Kirby had won the last few immunities, and I understand why Ferris would think that if he allowed Kirby to get on through, that she would just continue to win more immunities moving forward. That and also the jury perception of him keeping Kirby in a game when he could have taken her out would have been a bit questionable there. But on the other hand, him taking out Kirby does also make him the biggest threat in the game. It reminds me a lot of Jesse from Survivor 43, who was in a somewhat similar position to where he had someone willing to take him to the end, despite him possibly losing to that person, and by cutting them, it makes him the biggest threat in the game. So obviously it's a risky move to cut Kirby at Final 5 to where he probably does need to win out from that point on. And while he does fail to win Final 4 immunity, we actually see Mark and Caroline decide to keep him in the game, largely because Raymond was still very loyal to Ferris, to the point where Raymond didn't want to turn on him, which I do think is good work on Ferris's end, and it does cause Mark and Caroline to throw Raymond into fire instead, which I think is pretty interesting there. But obviously coming to Final 3, Ferris is in a spot to where he has to win Final Immunity in order to win the game, and he's able to do so. So I do think Ferris's game is pretty interesting for the most part. I do feel like it is one of the more impressive games in Australian Survivor history, especially among the winning games. And admittedly, there are definitely some holes within the game. I do think early on, I do think there were many points where Kirby was outplaying him. That's not particularly great. He obviously gets benefited by certain things at the swap, namely that twist at the Charles round really benefited him in the game. And even after the merge, I think there were definitely points where Kirby was getting ahead of Ferris, and there were points where Ferris dropped the ball, particularly at that Eden round, where despite him making the deal with Caroline and Kitty, the fact that they flipped on him so quickly is not particularly great either. And also the fact that he has to win final immunity to get towards the end of the game. Now, I don't know for sure if Raymond does take Ferris at the end, if he had gone through to the final three and won final immunity there. So I do think even that is a bit questionable. But still, there are definitely some holes within Ferris's game to where I can't say he's the best Australian Survivor winner. I probably would have him around number 3, at least among the Network 10 seasons of the show on my winner ranking. But I still think Ferris played a pretty impressive game for the most part. Definitely one of the more dynamic games we've seen across the show. And despite him making some missteps along the way, he was able to build some very solid bonds that was able to get him through a lot of the game. I think he was able to position himself pretty well, especially during a lot of the post-merge. And while I think a lot of his final tribal was actually kind of mediocre to where he definitely struggled to own up to his game, he was able to turn around by the end to where he won unanimously. So I think all those things makes this game pretty impressive. Definitely one of the more impressive winning games in Australian Survivor. His game is definitely the highest on a winner ranking compared to all those of the final 4. And it's for those reasons that I have him here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. Really helps with the channel. Now, I probably will be making a review to wrap up my coverage of this season, which has been pretty good. I really did enjoy this season, so stay tuned for that. I'm covering a whole bunch of shows right now, including Survivor 46 and The Amazing Race 36 and Big Brother Canada 12, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.